Storytelling and narratives in children's art. Narrative, a unique form in children's art. Emily, my 3-year-old granddaughter, is a prolific young artist. She loves to go through her portfolio. Emily eagerly explains all her paintings and drawings, giving names and attributes to each mark. She's well on her way to telling exciting narratives about her artworks. From an early age, students explore their art through narratives. Students tell stories about their art and share its secret meanings with parents and art teachers. These stories are samplings of ways I have seen children use narratives to describe their art. For Emily, after hard work of sharing her art, even her dolls are tired. Before our young artist goes to bed, she makes bedding for her play figures and talks them to sleep. Emily's finest creations are performance-style plays with stuffed animals and fast food figures. Emily's art is a multimedia expression that includes playing, drawing, and reflective narratives. Narrative art has always been an integral part of her playing, even before she started to draw on paper. Emily talks about her art to all friendly bystanders. The uniqueness in Emily's art is in her ability to reflect on experiences and tell stories about it. She tells wonderful stories in preparing to play, during her drawing, and in her reporting about her art. Narrative is a unique quality in Emily's art and in all her approach to making art. It is a facet of children's art that needs to be preserved. I don't collect Picassos, but I loved my collection of children's art. Prized pieces in my collection are those related to princesses, dinosaurs, and Polly Pockets. Art is real to children. It is manipulated as toys and set up in play arrangements. Children are in touch with what they create, they live it, experience it, and have no trouble finding works to talk freely about it. Adults are more separated from their art. The adult artist makes art which is explained by a critic, art historian, or a museum docent. Art touches children's deepest feelings, and through their art, children tell stories, commenting about the things they touch and know. Children's art is not about design formulas, design principles, or adult art techniques. To keep children's art close to children, adults need to value children's play and stories, which are the foundations for children's art. Children are well prepared to tell stories and to encounter the narrative of other artists. To get me to sit on the floor on her room and play, my daughter Anna used to say, "Dad, you never play with me." "Okay, let's make stuff," she would say. These were her code words for making art. Anna would then shop around the house for discarded supplies. Side by side, sharing creative moments prompted a free narrative. Without referring to our making things as art, we explained to one another what was happening, what was going to happen to our work, or what might happen to our work as it progressed. Student stories start my art class. The student shouldering his Egyptian sarcophagus backpack makes a stir when he walks into the classroom. He is delighted to recount his museum visit, mummy stories, and meeting with Tutankhamun. Everyone is aware that the start of a class is prime time, the most important part of the period. Effective art teaching includes strengthening and building on children's storytelling art. rushing to get down to the business of an art lesson, misses the children who come in talkative, busy, dreaming, telling stories, and waiting to share things with the teacher. Stopping the art class for the teacher's narrative creates a missed opportunity to start the art class with children's narrative and ideas. I noticed the elaborate patterns painted on a little girl's tiny fingernails. 50 seconds of attention on her art yields wonderful stories and a glimpse at her new nail polish colors. She narrates a story about the doodles on her notebook cover. In turn, these experimental designs become her fresh nail canvases. A few moments of sharing yields 1,000 art ideas from students. The class is no longer dominated by one teacher's art lesson. During class, a significant part of art teaching is listening to narratives, children talking to their art, about their artwork, to each other, and anyone else willing to listen. One way to approach art teaching is to step back from instructing techniques, grading, judging, or comparing students' art with ideal versions of adult art, or even steering children's art towards what the art teacher considers as art. Communication with children should be about their art and ideas. There's a world of difference between children's art and teacher-directed children's art. To help students connect with their own art, children need opportunities to talk about it. The art teacher has to trust students, knowing that the time spent on discussing students' ideas is worthwhile. Preserving storytelling in an art class involves having children talk about their art with the sincere belief that children have the best art ideas. Reading to children. And the fairy princess went to McDonald's for lunch and asked for chocolate soup. A few simple words can bring the house down and end an otherwise peaceful bedtime story. Children love their favorite picture books and take bedtime reading seriously. Just try to change a word in a storybook they have already memorized. You will be quickly faulted for not reading it the right way. Through bedtime stories, children are introduced to books, to reading, and the great art and imagination of illustrated book artists. Children are read to for important segments of their lives, becoming an audience to great stories and visual storytellers. As art educators, all of us need to introduce the art of telling stories, inventing stories, the fun of making up stories, and children telling their own stories. Opportunities need to exist for children to tell their own stories and to create plays based on them. Through puppetry, play acting, and making videos, children can find their own voices to express their art in stories. Art teaching needs to introduce the art of telling stories and inventing stories. At a time when children love to be read to, they also need to author their own books and write their own scripts. Art and significant stories. Blank papers are taped all along the art room's vertical surfaces, doors, closets, chalkboard, and display boards. The class entering early in the morning is called to rise from their sleepy stupor and gather around a small plastic pouch in the corner of the room. I found this in my Woodstock studio this summer. From the plastic pouch, I take out a tiny karate outfit that belonged to a fierce 6-year-old warrior, my son, Jacob. I describe lovingly each of these treasures that had great significance in my life. Next came a striped beige blanket in which our daughter Ilona was wrapped as we took her home from the hospital when she was born. I put a tiny beanie cap on my head explaining that it was Anna's first scout troop hat when she was little. Art comes from deeply felt objects and experiences that move the artist. Personally significant narratives captured the heart and imagination of my art class. While art in school is often defined by exercises or prescribed assignments, for me, art has always been a means to say something, a way to use a language that no other language allows. And so art allows me to speak about my mother's struggle with cancer and describe to students how my cancer series of paintings were a necessity to keep my sanity during the most difficult period. Through the most personal narratives, I tell stories of my art, relating it to important events in my life. After a short time, my students turn towards their papers on the wall to face their dreams, fears, and fantasies, making art that speaks about a decisive moment in their lives. Some students start drawing immediately, others readjust the paper, and some enter into deep contemplation. Everyone finds her path and has a lot to say, knowing that the art room is a place to say it, and there is someone who cares, someone listening. Throughout the classroom session, I listen to individual stories while encouraging the class. If you have something to say, you will find the right lens, the right brush, the appropriate media and technique. Art asks for your heart, not just skill in putting marks on papers. One way to approach art teaching is empowering students to speak, to tell their stories. Young students have so much of importance to say if someone is listening. Effective art teaching is not about clever art projects. It is receiving, listening, witnessing, and hearing children's stories and ideas. Art lessons should never overshadow the students' voices and ideas. Art teaching is a narrative. Let's look at your keychains, I say to my future art teachers. Their faces show surprise. After sharing our keychains, I ask, if you walked into your first arts class, what would an art teacher's keychain look like? With a cup of different key rings at our disposal and the bounty of found objects available in my art room, we set out to create keychains that will communicate to students, even in the form of small pocket objects, that this is a special room and a creative person lives inside. Your art teacher believes that art is not dead. It can still be handmade, created to be something better and more interesting than what one can buy. The art in teaching art is telling stories, demonstrating art as a narrative, accompanying a show and tell. On a large tablecloth set on the floor, picnic style, I spread my finds of the past summer. First, I unwrap a vintage kitchen clock from its original packaging. It's from the Cat House, a favorite antique store, where I discuss vintage kitchen gadgets with the owner. Next is a short stack of jazz-age wide ties circa 1930. They are still in their bright yellow wrappers to be opened with students like a birthday surprise. Also in the display are children's birthday party plates from the 50s. And no one believes that I brought the amazing Italian fish purse at Goodwill. But where else does an art connoisseur shop? Together, we share stories about shopping, places, and fun items of joint interest. I talk about the sources of each find, its history, and point it out in its finest details. The students respond, showing their appreciation with their own stories of collections. I show an interest in everyday objects and tell stories about finds and collections, just as I did with these summer finds. Art teaching is demonstrating art through the teacher's performance and show and tell. Art cannot be taught directly as other subjects, conveyed as mere information, principles, or facts. Art teachers teach art through stories. Does your art class know your favorite artist? I share my secret about Louise. Each time I see a show or a book of Louise Bourgeois' art, my students find out, since stories and souvenirs appears in class. I don't hide how we met and how she changed my art. I share my art interests and finds through an art teaching narrative. I tell stories, a new children's book, an antique children's handkerchief, or a vintage tablecloth illustrator who is part of the pantheon of heroes joining me in the classroom. Art teachers are great storytellers, telling about the great stories of art through our artist selves and creative experiences. The art in presenting adult art to children. The art in presenting adult art to children is weaving teachers' own stories and knowledge in with the children's stories. Viewing adult art on a museum tour should not give the impression that what is on the museum wall is a storybook to be deciphered for young viewers. Adult art is not an illustrated children's book, a picture with subtitles to be read to children. The adult art visited by children needs to be freshly discovered by each child. Children's stories about adult art should not be overshadowed by a teacher or a museum staff member. Adult art on museum walls should inspire children to tell their own stories based directly on experiencing the artwork. Seeing and encountering adult art should strengthen children's storytelling abilities. Visual thinking is not only exercising one's mind to provide correct or right answers, it is also about formulating one's own stories, thoughts, and opinions about artworks. As teachers in the classroom, we participate as students come up with narratives about their play and art. But once we have students engage in looking at masterworks, we are quick to tell students what is important about the piece. We don't allow students to use their finely tuned narrative skills to help them navigate the artworks themselves. As educators, it is important for us to sit back and let the students experience what is in front of them, to talk about it like they would talk about their dolls and interact with it like they would interact with their Legos. If you listen, children have amazing stories to tell. The role of the teacher is not only to bear all the important information, but to also act as a facilitator for the stories students already know and tell. All teachers can be a witness to children's stories, as children talk about their own art. As art educators, we need to prepare children to feel confident in their own stories about art. We need to prepare children to see artworks with understanding and confidence, to see that adult art can have many narratives or meanings. Museum guides need to pay close attention to children's stories about the art in a museum. Guides need to be careful not to interpret, tell, or explain away adult art, or the pleasure children have when experiencing adult art. We all need to recognize that children have natural abilities and tools of their own to experience and observe adult art. stories about my art. I share my narrative about my art with students because I'm passionate and I can passionately tell its stories, disclose personal views, and relate the importance of personal stories in creating art. By sharing my narratives with students, they are freer to share their art stories with me. I tell my stories to illustrate how an artist thinks, to explain sources for artistic inspiration, and to share what it means to create a body of work. The Cancer Years 201 to 205. From my journal. These notations are a diary of one of the most difficult times in my life. In January 2001, Mother was diagnosed with cancer. Her fight to survive included operations, chemotherapy treatments, and incredible suffering. The lines recorded on paper surfaces found at the Markey Cancer Center in Lexington, Kentucky, have been a means of coping and a voice to speak about the unspeakable. A current exhibit at the University of Kentucky Art Museum posts the stark inscription over long tables displaying records of the cancer years. I hesitate to use the word art in referring to the drawn and painted records of this period. In the show are desperate marks appearing on EKG rolls used to monitor life, papers that stood by helplessly as my mother slipped away. I added human marks to those spewed out by the machine, overseeing the situation, my notes on rolls that monitored my mother's life. There are many painted folders on exhibit, folders of records, charts, and test results we anxiously awaited. In 2 years, the patient history folder turned into a book with multiple dividers. The trash can was my canvas source. To tell the story, I retrieved all disposed papers from discarded instructions to duplicate forms. These became appendices to the official report. As for brushes, there were ample cotton swabs, eyedroppers, and syringes. I drew and painted more direct and primal marks than I ever made as an artist. I wrote notes repeating the doctor's premonitions. We will outsmart the cancer. It was art, not intending to be art. The scratch paint marks just lessened the pain of my life. In the show are some of the prescriptions, instruction sheets, and warnings tagged onto medications. These papers were always quickly disposed of, and the risks on these sheets were seldom shared with the exhausted patient and family. Had anyone read these sheets on which I painted? New menus were constantly available for ghost food that came in and left the room untouched. I painted on one menu sheet just in time to make up a new one. Paper flow punctuated the day, and I dutifully accommodated and accumulated papers to be marked nervously with paint. Even though the Markey Cancer Center has large windows, we were encapsulated in our pain. My knee was my easel, the hospital room, a firmly focused studio. There were no seams between my mother and what flowed onto my papers. My breath, my mother's distorted form, and the open drink containers were all closed from the outside world. There was no artist and observer, just tense moments to mark. As an abstract artist all my life, my only exposure to drawing people was a parade of models during my student days. Mom was not on a model stand, and her deformed body only hinted at the beautiful woman that used to take me to school. My marks had no reference to figure drawing I used to make. I could seldom look up to draw her lifeless, contorted body. The impression I made on paper came from an inner code, not the clinical descriptions of her limbs. I envisioned surgeries and images deeper than her many X-rays, ultrasounds, and CAT scans. I went as deep as art allowed me to face the cancer monster. When nurses asked me what I was doing, I couldn't say I was doing art. How do you paint cancer, they asked. I wondered if anything that really matters can be painted. How do you paint my mother's courage? Art marks were a way of holding on, holding hands. Sharing the notebooks became a sober moment of conversation when she was alert. My mother, who was always the biggest fan of my art, would say, "How beautiful it is." The last surface I kept unmarked was the hospital bracelet my mother wore as she began her battle. The bracelet is inserted inside the pages of a painted life support system manual. Narration in To-Do List Portraits, 205 to 206. As the rest of my family moved towards computerized calendars to steer their lives, I was determined to keep everything in my head. My son, the cellist, determined to get the most practice time from each day, organized his day inside the square of a wall chart. My wife's pocket calendar was always filled with snippets of information, then covered by tiny post-its as she completed a task. As I resisted this structure for organization, I spent my morning walks creating to-do lists in my mind. By the time I rounded the corner of Brook Hill Drive, I had firm plans for an early morning painting, an essay, or an art lesson. I still plan during senior walks, but I now use lists to debrief on paper following my morning routine. Each to-do list guides my moves, my thoughts, and my priorities in life's curious mix of chores and creative tasks. Time spent creating my to-do lists is like the time others spend reading the morning paper. Here I can make the first fresh marks of the day. I started saving these lists, then they became part of my art. In insignificant papers, diaries that have no ambition to become diaries, I found clues to my art, the art of planning, organizing, and navigating life over informal surfaces. I found this recycling very satisfying, to write and draw a portrait at the same time. For 2 years, I made portraits as a daily diary. I selected a book format to illustrate changes in the portraits and in the life behind the features. Unlike a painted canvas which covers up its history, separate portraits on pages in a book can trace a constantly evolving face. Unlike the tradition of a single image portrait, the multiple portraits on my pages were more like a constantly rolling camera. In my portraits, I used words, narration to accompany images. Titles and transcripts supported my own dialogue with the portrait in progress. Since the words often got tangled in my drawings, words even I struggled to decipher, I offer the following explanation. A glossary to the portraits. How can one draw a portrait? This phrase sets up the parameters of my daily search to answer what is a portrait. I imagine waking up each day and having my picture taken. I search for ways to face the camera and invent angles from behind the lens. Each day, every portrait is an uncertainty. Each day's quest poses more questions to be responded to in other portraits. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the person before you, and how can this day be molded into an image? I cannot draw a portrait. This is an assertion appearing in many drawings. When students are taught portrait formulas, they come to believe that portrait making is a craft to be mastered, so it can be skillfully performed on demand. It is hard to admit that no one knows how to draw a portrait. My portraits reflect on the uncertainties, the doubts, the questions which go on inside every artist who tries to draw a portrait. My art tries to make visible the artist talking inside, the debate in my head during the act of making a portrait. Why draw portraits in the 21st century? After spending a lifetime as an abstract artist, I keep asking myself why anyone should bother making portraits in the first place. If I could not write this question on my art, I would write it on my studio walls. Writing an artwork while shaping a portrait's outcome is a unique opportunity to document the questions which are foremost on my mind. Do you take lessons? I contemplate my life as an art teacher using this phrase to question the role of teaching in portraiture and in other acts of making art. What is the role of art lessons? And how can the artistic independence required for the self-guided exploration of making a portrait be taught? Is art teaching just a series of lessons from the masters, a compendium of used formulas? Would students be upset to find out that the art teachers don't have answers? I place my portrait books into young artists' hands as an example of my quest, a journey every portrait artist has to make on his own. Some of my portraits have labels pointing out the nose or a mouth. The name of a feature is sometimes used to substitute for its image. The place for the nose may be pointed to when it's not pictured. I use labels to point to otherwise features in the portrait, acknowledging their existence while promoting the viewer to look beyond them. A portrait is a complex entity and not necessarily a grouping of correct features. I take stock of features and question their roles. I also leave out features or leave some portraits featureless, saying, here, even without features, a portrait exists. This is not art. Some portraits include a disclaimer. I give myself room to innovate by warning the viewer that what is being seen is not art. I state my intention to look for meaning and not likeness, searching beyond the bounds of traditional portraiture. The phrase is a reminder to myself and to my audience not to expect pretty faces. 26 days of conversing with nature, a narrative record, Woodstock, New York, 2007. Since 1971, I have journeyed to a field in the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York. During the 14-hour car ride from Kentucky, I dream and plan each summer's art. Upon arrival, I converse with the stately trees and great old friends on the ground before implementing my summer plans. The field in Woodstock, New York, is where I stage summer art plays. The previous year's experiences meld with the light, smells, and sounds of nature to become the summer's unique script. The sun begins to rise as I pull my art supplies up the edge of a circular clearing in an old child's wagon called Big Chief. The promise of a new day are projected on the airy field that empowers greater dreams than I could dream anywhere else. I gather my tools to begin. During previous summers, I dressed the trees in canvases. I rolled soft papers over the grassy floors and used sticks, stones, and leaves to brush over the bumpy carpets. The summer I lost my mother, I poked holes into the long white floor covers to drain streams of paint, expressing the flow of tears. When my first child, Ilona, was born, I painted all summer with the joyful brushes of fresh blooms and new grasses. As Ilona grew older, I made large stencils of the hill, creating landscapes in which she could participate. I go into the field to celebrate and be comforted. This summer, I drew with my grandchildren while reflecting on the passage of time. Each drawing is prominently marked with the date, and at the end of the summer, I lined up all 26 drawings in a timeline that followed the 26 days I spent in this field. I inscribed each picture on the back, recalling highlights of the summer, and the following narratives are from the backs of these drawings. Day 1. A delicious first day, outside and away from the inescapable routines that build up in my studio. I draw any way I want and anything I want. None of the struggles of working indoors this past year. None of the internal turbulences of looking into a mirror, being surrounded by faded family photos to find clues to my own portrait. In the light-soaked field, attention is drawn away from myself. Day 4. I walk over the field and dance all over the page. I feel the exuberance and daring of a younger artist. It's day 4, yet all the fresh thoughts and emotions make it difficult to focus and steer my art. Day 7. Did the silence become louder, or am I listening more to the music of the field? The insects, the wind, the wild turkey calling its flock arouse a seventh-day symphony. I join the string section and bow along with an old ruler. Lines begin to strum to nature's hum. Day 9. Yesterday, day 9, I drove to the city to see Richard Serra's exhibit at MoMA. Strolling inside monumental walls around curved steel fences felt so different from the open field. Yet the high curves cutting across MoMA's garden floor are closely related to the march of trees on the hill. Day 15. Today it's all about making sense of the forest's complexity. I imagine installing fences on the field to organize the landscape. Day 17. On an antiquing trip, I bought the perfect carpet to go under the trees. I unrolled a wonderful vintage American carpet in the clearing. The carpet's elegant ways of organizing the floor influence each drawing today. The carpet, quickly claimed by Anna for her apartment, will be shipped to Brooklyn, but its simple rendition of the geometry of nature stays with me. Day 22. Yesterday, at the library fair, I found an old book of Frank Lloyd Wright's drawings. I carried everywhere, soaking up Wright's agility with the ruler during a summer of ruled line landscapes. I confidently build mountains and erect trees with my ruler on a flat paper. Day 23. In a few days, the summer will be over. Last night, we camped out with the children and I lay under the tent. I noticed how our canopy covered segments of nature. The final drawings are the mountains surrounding the field, symbolized by giant tents. I am not a landscape painter. Each year I just collect clues from experiences and visions from the hill to find new inspiration. Each year I take my place in a familiar surrounding, allowing the best views and ideas to encircle me. For a few significant weeks, I live in the landscape and record stories of my living as summer finds. My art teaching is a narrative of sharing my art and art ideas. I hope to bring my students close to an artist world, detailing the formulation of art from experiences. On my way home, I think about ways of taking my students to Woodstock, of narratives I can share about my summer art. The ability to tell my story in an inspiring way is the best assurance that students will use their own narratives for shaping their original art. A challenge in school art teaching is not to present art as assignments, but as narratives of the artist and how artists work.